Welcome back. You're listening to the Voice of Russia in the heart of London. I'm Polina Boiko, and today we're in the studio to discuss the controversial issue of chemical castration. Up to 100 prisoners have volunteered to be chemically castrated as part of a government pilot scheme to alter the behaviour of high-risk sex offenders. The experimental programme is being carried out in a specialist prison for male sex offenders in Nottingham. Results from similar schemes in Sweden and Denmark suggest that chemical castration can cut the rates of reoffending from 40 down to 5%. The practice of so-called chemical castration has divided professional and public opinion. Some say that chemical castration is a way of avoiding lengthy jail sentences and say that a child's right to protection is much more important than the freedoms of paedophiles. But others say that drugs don't get to the root of the issue and will be ineffective. And it's not just the UK which is piloting such schemes. Last October, the Russian parliament approved a law allowing judges to sentence those convicted of sex offences against children under the age of 16 to mandatory chemical castration. Joining me in the studio today are Jonathan Taylor, Child Protection Specialist, and Nikhil Roy, Programme Development Director of Penal Reform International. And on the line we have Donald Findlater, Director of the Lucy Faithfull Foundation. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Hi.
Let's jump straight into the issue. Should sex offenders be chemically castrated? I'd like to ask Jonathan, as a child protection expert, what's your opinion?
Certainly, probably from what you've just said, it's the voice of the victim that we must protect here. But there's the bigger issue at the moment of the sex offenders that are being convicted and are subsequently going then into the penal system, into prison. I always believe that we know that the prison system is full. I spent 7-8 years interacting with online sex offenders, being able to identify many on every single day I went online. Our prisons are full, and we do have the problem that if sex offenders are identified on an annual basis, what are we going to do with them? You know, in the prison system at the moment, we have some very serious child sex offenders. The low-risk ones, a lot of them won't actually go into the penal system. So what we must be looking at now, for the future, is how we can treat and monitor sex offenders within society. Part of that, as we know, is the cognitive behavioural therapy, which is proven to work. But of course, when that's used in conjunction with something like chemical castration, the figures are there to be seen that this actually is a way forward. That said, a lot of the problems will be about which offenders. Obviously, we know about there's a voluntary. They have to have empathy with the victim. There are certain areas that must be covered. But also, so how do we categorise which offender is actually going to work with society, with doctors, as it were, and with therapists? So it's very difficult about to know who's going to actually be given that type of treatment and will it work.
Nikhil, what's your take on the situation?
Well, as you'd expect me to say, as a penal reformer, it is a complicated issue. I don't think there are simple solutions. One point that Jonathan makes is that our prisons are full, which is true. And therefore, we should not use chemical castration as the remedy for prisons being full. So, I mean, just to put that out there, you know, so it's not either or. So we need to look at this in a much more holistic way. There are several points I'd like to make. The first is that we're talking about human beings. I agree that victims have to be at the forefront of our concern. But those who offend, it's not a one-size-fits-all remedy at all. So these are also human beings, okay? And they have their issues, they have their concerns, they have their problems. Who knows what they've suffered? And so we need to sort of think about, you know, what the sort of issues are in terms of the remedies that we are proposing. Jonathan's already referred to this, but I think just to reiterate the point that it should be voluntary, not forced, if it is being used. And this is very important because I can see we've mentioned Scandinavia and the UK. But I can see this going out as a general sort of remedy, across the world. And then suddenly you've got, people with less than, good human rights records saying, yeah, hey, we've got a solution here. Let's use this. And it's very important that, we understand this has to be voluntary, not forced. It has to be based on proper consultations and medical advice. And I think this is extremely important, and medical including psychological advice. Now, in this country, we know that offenders and prisoners have access to psychiatrists and get psychological help. But that's not necessarily the case all over the place. So I think we really need to be careful about what we're suggesting. A couple of other points. One is that we need to have more evidence. Penal Reform International is not convinced that there's enough evidence just on the sample size that has been talked about so far. And we need to have evidence also as regards things like side effects, which I'm not a medical expert, I'm not a doctor, but if somebody is going to propose that these sorts of interventions happen, then I'd like to know what are the possible side effects. And the other point I'd like to make is that this is something that needs ongoing care and treatment. And sometimes, often what will happen is that it's offered in the prison or in that setting, in the criminal justice setting. But once the person is released, what happens then? And therefore, the ongoing sort of follow-up support and care that's needed needs to be properly thought through. So I think all those reasons, it's a complicated issue, and there isn't one headline which we can neatly use to capture the complexities.
Just to remind you, you're listening to the Voice of Russia in the heart of London. I'm Polina Boiko, and today we're in the studio to discuss the controversial issue of chemical castration. Donald, you work for a charity that seeks to prevent child abuse from happening by helping to change offenders for the better. Would chemical castration, in your opinion, help safeguard children against the threat of child abuse? And how effective would it be?
I think none of us is medics. So in terms of some of the debates that we ought to have, the fact that we're not medically qualified actually will have some limitations to what we can do. I've been involved in discussing what is called chemical castration and running a clinic for sex offenders for a considerable period of time. A number of those sex offenders came to the clinic having reoffended, and they reoffended whilst chemically castrated. So I think there's that I'm worried that the debate assumes that if we somehow manage chemically to extinguish or reduce sexual arousal, that we've dealt with the problem. Well, we haven't fully dealt with the problem, and all the research evidence about chemical interventions, whether that's using hormone treatments, whether that's using, a number of the antidepressant medications that people would typically hear about, which have an effect of reducing sex drive, there is good evidence that they have a significant impact on about 10 or 15% of known sex offenders currently, but we mustn't assume they're useful for the vast majority of the rest of them. And they're not much use in and of themselves. They need to be kind of a complement, the kind of other psychological treatments that need to engage with the thinking of the individual. Because why people sexually offend is to do with how they think about themselves, and particularly how they think about children and how they think about kind of sexual relationships or whatever kind. So treatments that simply reduce arousal don't deal with what's going on in these individual heads. And in the long term, the only way of reducing long-term risk is to grapple with what's in their heads, which is what psychological treatments will do. And that's what, as a children's charity, we've been delivering for a considerable number of years. So yes, there are complexities to this, that people think there's a simple solution which is graspable, but it's not that simple. I'm absolutely clear that chemical interventions of various kinds are really useful, and there's quite a lot of sex offenders that would really value access to them. So they seriously have to be considered. I think voluntarism is really important. I think if we're doing anything medically with an individual that does have side effects, let's make no bones about that, then we need to make sure that medical practitioners can practice ethically, and that therefore the benefit of the patient's important. Now, if someone doesn't want to benefit from this treatment and is seen as dangerous, then maybe the choice they're then making is, I will remain behind bars then. And so I won't have the chemical intervention, I will remain in prison. But that's not what most sex offenders, I think, would choose to do if they're given an option.
Can I just jump in here and ask Jonathan, do you agree that sex offences are often more about violence and domination than they are about sex or sexual fantasy?
I would say no to that, but obviously there's going to be a lot that will be based on the violent side of it. And we chatted earlier about the different types of categorisation of the moral conflict, the social conflict, and the sociopathic. We've got different types of offender. But one thing I want to pick up with Donald is the fact that the serious sex offender who says, no, I'm not going to volunteer for this because this is a bit like the sociopathic or the social conflict offender that says, no, I don't want this, I'm not going to get involved. He's a serious sex offender, but he's not going to be in prison for life. For the majority, some will be, but the majority won't be. They'll be in there for the 10 to 15 years. That could be therefore an argument for mandatory chemical castration, because this is somebody who's a serious. I would say, for me, it's about categorisation and the risk assessment of the offender. Now, if you go to a lot of the prisons, whether Watton or if you go into Grendon, a lot of these people in for sex offences are serious sex offenders. The person that's online and downloading 10,000 images isn't going to prison. So these are virtually all serious sex offenders. So personally, I think that might be an argument to say, well, let's bring in mandatory.
If someone poses such a threat to...
Such a threat. We all did some research on this, and I actually looked last night, and one of the newspapers actually put out a poll to its readers. And when they just asked the question, what do you think of chemical castration, 70% said it should be compulsory. So that's a view from the public.
I'd like to get Nikhil's take. What do you think of compulsory chemical castration?
Well, I mean, let me just respond to Jonathan's point about public polling on issues like this. These are very emotive issues, and often, I'm all for democracy. I'm all for, everybody having a free vote and making sure that, there's rule of law and so on. But if you take some of these issues, for example, does the public want to see the death penalty sort of reintroduced? You will find that often public opinion is on the side of issues which human rights activists have fought long and hard to make sure, never get on the statute books. And I think it's because of the lawmakers and those who make legislation that in many countries, including in the UK, I would argue, that we don't have the death penalty. Now, we're not discussing the death penalty, but I just wanted to make that point, that public opinion is not necessarily the best judge for these sorts of issues. I think we need to look at medical opinion, we need to look at sentencing options, we need to look at treatment options, and I think all of those really are important if we're going to sort of go down the route of making it mandatory. You asked me, do I think it should be mandatory?
Is it ethical?
We're not in favour of compulsory chemical castration. I mean, let me put that out straight away. And it goes back to the point I was making earlier. These things have to be properly thought through. There has to be checks and balances in place. And you don't want to do things which often have, huge other effects. And as I say, we haven't got all the medical advice. We haven't got all the knowledge about, what else could happen to people. And we're in danger of sort of, making experiments here with individuals who, yes, they've done something wrong. I mean, don't get me, wrong on this. I mean, we all appreciate, that there are serious issues here which need to be dealt with. Victims need to be protected. They need to be properly, compensated. They need to be helped, to overcome, the trauma and tragedy of what's happened to them. Therefore, so the people who are offending need to be properly dealt with. But to think that, just by chemical castration, you're somehow going to deal with this problem, I think is a fallacy. And we need to look at the full sort of range of options that are available to us.
Can I build on what you've just been saying? Because I entirely agree with that. And can I say, I think of the people on this radio station, I've the only one directly been involved in sex offender treatment programs, been involved with people who have been subject to chemical castration. So I'm not opposed to it in a principle at all. I think it's very useful, but we have to be aware of its limitations. And all the studies done recognise there are profound limitations. So we're naive if we don't recognise them. We're also naive. I work for a child protection charity doing sex offender treatment. So our starting place is what is best for children. What I know, we get phone calls to our helpline here from actual adult men saying, I have a problem with what I'm thinking about children. Can I get help? So there's all sorts of help that we can make available to them. We also get calls from people, from children who have experienced abuse or are experiencing abuse, who will not report the crimes because their abuser is their dad or their brother or their uncle. So the talk that kind of tends to be very punitive about sex offences often simply silences the victim. So I think in whatever tones we discuss these matters, we have to recognise victims do come first, and we only must deploy things that are effective and don't effectively silence victims and don't actually fail to work with sex offenders. You know, as I remind you what I said before, sex offences start in the head of the individual, not in the genitals. We have to deal with the person's head as well as what's happening in the groin area.
Just to remind you, you're listening to the Voice of Russia in the heart of London. I'm Polina Boiko, and today we're in the studio to discuss the controversial issue of chemical castration. I'm joined in the studio by Jonathan Taylor, Child Protection Specialist, Nikhil Roy, Programme Development Director of Penal Reform International, and on the line we have Donald Findlater, Director of the Lucy Faithfull Foundation. Jonathan, you've said that mandatory chemical castration could work for these high-risk sex offenders that are a threat. How effective would it be on people that, as you say, that aren't seeking help?
Well, as I mean, I agree with everybody here in some sense. We just you've got the behaviour and you've got the cognitivism. Certainly, if somebody doesn't agree to it and it's mandatory, the only thing you're ever going to can change is his behaviour, because you're not going to get inside his head, because he's not going to agree or sit down with the therapist, such as Donald, to actually talk about the issues. So, is there going to be a difference? Well, there will be, because he's actually been given a chemical. And one of the other things we've got problem here, when again doing the research, one of the biggest issues is there are many, many side effects. Some awful side effects, and that's one of the reasons why a lot of the studies, they can't use a placebo, because it's so obvious that the person isn't actually being treated. So we have got big issues about when it comes to actually understanding if you like the side effects and obviously the human rights issues, which I do bear in mind. But you've still got the issue of these serious sex offenders, and I please don't get me wrong. For chemical castration to actually work, it has to work in conjunction with cognitive behavioural therapy. That way, the whole package together will have some good effect on, if you like, protecting the offender from re-offending, which obviously will protect further victims out there.
Is there any information on how many of the sexual offenders that there are, what percentage is actually open for rehabilitation and wants to get help? We've got these 100 prisoners or so that have been referred in Nottingham, but you're a criminal psychologist. Is this the norm?
It's not the norm. If you look at the amount of sex offenders in the system, which Nick will be able to possibly assist in the penal system, you've only got a relatively very small amount of prisons. Grendon is one, prison Grendon in Oxfordshire, that actually specialises in sex offender treatment programmes. There should be more prisons that have that. There should be more hospitals available. There possibly could be a lot more offenders who want to come onto this type of scheme. And this is just perhaps the start of it, by 100 being referred to the doctor.
So all in all, is this a good start? Are there other things you feel the government should be doing in order to reduce the number of sexual offences taking place in the UK?
I'll have a crack at that. But can I just, picking up your last point about, what's the scale of the issue that we're grappling with? 100 prisoners, we've been told, in fact, it's not precisely that, have been subject to, voluntarily, to chemical interventions. That's as against probably about 8,000 currently imprisoned sex offenders. And in the community right now, we have in the UK, now actually England and Wales, we have 38,500 registered sex offenders out in the community. Most of them actually behaving very well. They're behaving well partly because many of them are motivated to do that and have access to psychological treatments. There's not enough of those available, but probation service as well as the prison service provide probably 1,500 treatment places a year on psychological treatments. And that's desperately important and significantly reduces risks. There, and I think in the UK we have a phenomenal kind of effective system. It's called multi-agency public protection arrangements, where in every prison, every sex offender coming out of prison, even the sex offenders that get a conviction that don't go to prison, are end up on the sex offender register, which means police, probation, children's services, health departments, housing can collaborate over the range of things they're going to do to assess those individuals for their risk and make sure that they're effectively managed in the community. So chemical interventions, they're not new. I mean, we've had kind of hormonal treatments since the kind of 60s. So they're not new. What is new in this 100 trials is trying some other medications and seeing how they work to complement the psychological treatments we already know can be highly effective. So there's still a job to do, and one of the jobs to do is what the Home Office asked my organisation, the Lucy Faithfull Foundation, to actually provide some public education, not about how do we treat sex offenders, but how do we keep our children safe from sex offenders, because most of the 38,000 sex offenders in the community aren't the biggest risk to my or any of your listeners' children. The biggest risk is the sex offender that isn't known by the police, by the social workers, has never been to prison, and it's someone's neighbour or a relative, and they certainly don't want to plan to get caught. So what is it that parents need to know? So Home Office asked us to educate parents, so we've got a Parents Protect website for every parent across the country and every grandparent to just know we have a part to play in keeping children safe. Alongside of prisons, alongside of police officers and probation officers, we have a part to play in making sure children across the country are safe from sexual abuse.
Nikhil, are you happy with the criminal justice system and the way in which it deals with sexual offenders?
Two points. I mean, one is, the importance of addressing root causes. I think this is very important, and I think Donald's already sort of talked about that. But when we talk about, when you look at the criminal justice system and you look at criminals, you need to have some understanding. There has to be some studies done, some sort of profiling of, who the people are, where, what are their backgrounds, where are they coming from. And it's not just about looking at the sort of sexual elements of the crime that they have committed, but looking more broadly at them as human beings. What are the pathways that have led them into that particular sort of criminal kind of behavior. And we really need to have more understanding of this, and we really need to sort of work better on trying to get to the bottom of this. And the other thing I would say is that, with the criminal justice system in general, I think there is it is much too punitive, and we'd like to see more restorative justice measures being introduced into the system. And by that, I don't mean some sort of, soft treatment for, people to go off on holidays, as is often portrayed in some media reporting. But actually, the access to, skilled and trained personnel who are not prison officers and policemen and guards, but actually psychologists, doctors, social workers, people who can provide counsellors, who can provide that kind of help. And there are examples of those sorts of initiatives across the country. Unfortunately, a number of them are now facing funding crises, and it should be interesting to ask the government, as to why, we would want to sort of, invest in something which is unknown, the side effects, the potential consequences, and cut back on things which are known to work, and why not invest in restorative justice and try and find better ways to deal with these issues.
Jonathan, any final thoughts?
The problem of child sex abuse has never been really recognised as what I believe is the huge problem and the magnitude of the actual offending since perhaps the internet. It's now huge, and I just think that if it's going to get worse, which it could do, and more offenders are going to be identified and prosecuted, if the police are actually going to police it a bit more, then we're going to have to find ways of monitoring within society. That's got to happen, and anything that can assist with protecting future victims, which, please, I do believe it's something that could work in conjunction with everything else. As Nick says, regarding you've got MAPA, but you've got the therapists, you've got psychologists, you've got everybody in place that can assist offenders from reoffending. I think everything should be used so as to actually protect the possible future victims.
Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for today. Thank you all very much for joining me. You've been listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Polina Boiko, and joining me in this discussion was Jonathan Taylor, criminal psychology specialist and child protection expert, Nikhil Roy, Programme Development Director of Penal Reform International, and on the line we had Donald Findlater, Director of the Lucy Faithfull Foundation. You've been listening to The Voice of Russia in London. Stay tuned. We'll be back after the news.